was restored. So even if we're going to be talking about the HDR technique, we spent a lot of time and treated the negative, and this is very, very important. We have used the technology that most avant-garde, and we have heritage, but the most important element is always the original negative. So we have to do whatever possible to be able to use it, and in this case the effort means 2 hours of repair work, opening up all dyes, all colors, and also applying a chemical treatment. It's true, without this effort we limit ourselves, and if we had not done it, we would not have done even the HDR, because the nuances that are present in the camera negative often are not found in a duplicate negative dupe that has come from the silver chain. So some details are lost on the way, and once you use the most avant-garde technology to recover all nuances, well, we will not obtain the same results. So the strategy of StudioCanal is to use HDR on the heritage. The important thing is to start from the original prints. If the original prints are at risk, are endangered, we have to treat them, and you have not stopped at the first obstacles or difficulties. Afterwards, I would like to add something else which is quite important, that when you have made the last restoration of Abu Dhabi, well, Ocketard was living and present, whereas today he's no longer alive, and he cannot obviously tell us how it was shot. So we have tried to put together the two worlds. We have not stopped at the first obstacles, and we had not give up at any obstacle, because the equipe of had worked, the team had worked on the dupe, but we performed a photochemical restoration of the film, and so the elements of the restoration, the one before last, served us to make up for the absence of this person who is no longer with us. So we try and find whatever was present in the original negative, and we did everything not to leave anything astray, and we have used whatever had been done in the restoration before the last one to give all the elements. So for some years this has been done, because we have performed investigations that were precise and detailed on the original print. The film was made also by a filmmaker, film director, and we know that Godard is always skeptical to work on the films of the past, but this time we tried. We contacted him. He was kind enough, but he told us that he was not interested in working on his films of the past. So we respected the will of the director, although for me it's a little difficult to accept something like that. So we started from the work that had been started by Godard, and this is the historical premise of the restoration, and now we are going to see how to apply the HDR technology not only to the heritage film but also to the black and white films, which is not a very easy or common thing to do. And before passing on to this aspect, I would like to ask Jean-Pierre, what was the strategy of StudioCanal vis-à-vis the heritage films and HDR, and when you started having the Blu-ray films come up on the heritage, among the heritage films. The Terminator 2, 3 years ago, was the first film. Why did we choose this option? Because the first was that we saw that some films had gone out of the catalog, also of the 90s and year 2000, that films that were using this technology, 4K with HDR. And this technique proved to be interesting. So we said, let's apply it on films that lie themselves to this. What does this mean? HDR allows us to have more brightness, more contrast, so a brighter version. So an action film, a spectacular film, this will produce an immediate advantage. And on Terminator 2, there was a project that was a little crazy to convert it into a 3D film, and not doing it ourselves, but doing it directly with James Cameron. So a huge responsibility. So when we decided this, we discussed it with his team, and we said, and he made himself available, and we said, let's take advantage. So we had the director with us, so we decided it was together. And he used the HDR in a classic form that we all know about, and he accepted to put in elements that were not included in the first version. And as a director, we have accompanied the project with the director, and this release was successful because the fans appreciated it, and there was an international release. I have this CD in my office, and the result was excellent. Not all the time we have been collaborating with directors, because some are no longer here with us, but we did some Rambos, the re-editing of Escape from New York and Fog. Total Recall has not been released yet. We are preparing it. Cliffhanger. So at the beginning, you started concentrating yourselves on the action American films. Yes, American and action films. We knew that HDR, to some extent, would have pleased the fans, but also the troops, the crews, because this would allow us to overcome the limits of the time and allow for higher spectacularization of the films. We have made this on Paddington 2 along with the director, so we have elaborated some elements of the films. And this aspect of this strategy vis-à-vis the classic HDR is to give back the physical format. What is this physical format? We know that today we look at the films in streaming, and we look at them, but the physical format is the market and at its very end. So what we assess that the clients and the fans of our films look for physical versions at the top of the range. So we can use this format 4K or HDR, because when they buy these DVDs, they will be top of the range. So we have used Blu-ray discs, and if you are fans and you want this edition, and then you are going to be buying the reader courts, and you will have the 4K disc. And this approach worked out well, and we have sold out the versions of the 4K films in 4 weeks. Over 10,000 prints sold, more or less. And I remember that we have received personal messages of colleagues that were working in other companies that were fans that would tell us, we can't find the box anymore, the case anymore with all the films, so can you find it for us? And the first choice was to pick a well-known film to apply the HDR technique that would lie themselves very well to the new technology. So it's the so-called HDR moment. So there are explosion of bombs and flames, and then the flames, you can see many more details. So rendering the film much more spectacular. And this was the approach you have adopted. An approach that is a very logical one, and all the major have had it all over the States, because the first releases of Warner in Blu-ray were the Harry Potter and Batman, and Sony did the same. So I believe that this is a little bit historical. So from my personal point of view, well, some years have elapsed when the HDR technology, actually my trips to Los Angeles, I did very many tests, and I have to say that the first test I saw on the normal films, so not in the HDR moments in the 60s and 70s, well, the result was terrible. So, as usual, when new technologies arise, there is a trend to go a little beyond, and it's a mistake, but at the very beginning you don't know it. And what I said at the beginning, I saw something really horrible. Well, the result was terrible, horrible. So it was necessary to make a step backward, wait a minute, having others make mistakes, and then come back. And this brings us to the subject of the discussion of today. So starting from an American category, and how did StudioCanal decide to make a complete catalog, HDR, to black and white films of different times, which is, one is a bout, souffle, and also Elephant Man. And now I give the floor to you, so you explain to us this choice. Well, it's an aspect that is a very delicate one, because the catalog, as you said, is very important. So as well, the responsibility is important. We pass by, whereas the catalog remains. Like the managers of a castle. The castle remains and the managers go. So many questions arise, and for the black and white films, at the beginning we did not want to use the HDR. It's not really suitable for these films. We risk not to respect the work, and it's a problem. So we did not want to talk about this, and we made a purely technical consideration by putting in perspective what we wanted to give our fans. And there is something very simple to say. I don't know that you heard about the gamut, you know, the range of colors that are perceived by the eye. It has a wide range of colors, but the supports we use to project a film are not able to cover up the whole range of colors that your eye could see. So the gamut video that we know with DVD or Blu-ray is like this, Rex 709, and then you have the gamut cinema, which is even wider, which is the DCI, which is even wider and more extensive, and then the HDR, which is even wider. It's the 2020 that embraces them all. And then what you find in the Prince 35 millimeters is very close to the DCI, although it's not the same thing. When the DCI was made, obviously different attempts were made, and it's similar, and it's even wider than the 709 that we can find both in DVD and the Blu-ray. And so we said HDR can be the right one. It's a package, it's an instrument. We're not obliged to use the instrument throughout all its facets, its aspects. If I buy a drill hammer to make holes in my garden, not necessarily will I have to make holes in my whole garden. So we said we cannot do it with our 709. So whenever we release a master, which is we called master video, DVD or Blu-ray, so whenever we release a master, we know that we are going to face limits. So we should use HDR not to have limits any longer. We should not use it to find things that do not exist in films. We're not here to take away the true nature of the film and disrespect the film, but HDR will allow us to overcome our limits. So at the beginning, we confronted ourselves with collaborators, and they asked us, why do you use this technology? And we said, likewise, we want to use it to respect all the elements of the film. So when we have made a restoration of both bout, souffle and the Elephant Man, we said, the fans will find in these versions the integrity of the cinema version, because this container, this tool allowed us to obtain this result. And the technique is a very simple one, because it's a meter, as you said before. It's not necessarily you have to reach the peak or the maximum, the top limit of the values, even with the Dolby, not necessarily you have to use the whole brightness range. So I have realized this on a recent film. We needed to make the HDR version of the film, and with Dario he said, well, come with us, and he said, yes, I will come along. So we worked together, and we worked for 3 days, and after 3 days we said, well, with T26 it's wrong, and the HDR was not right, and this huge container did not want to show extravagant things. He just needed some extra functions to be able to edit better his film, but to some extent he respected his film, and this container allows us to stock all the things we need, or to get closer to the, as close as possible to the original version, because the big advantage of using HDR on black and white, and I talked about this with our friend Glover Fritz, is that we can get closer to the right dimension of the film. And it's not simply seeing things in brighter images, because after 3 minutes I would get blinded, but the HDR helps us to have blacker blacks and details of blacks, and have lights in the white, so with more shades of the image vis-a-vis what you have already in the film, and when you digitalize them, they get lost. So that's why StudioCanal wanted to make a restoration of HDR of these black and white films, because and I agree, working with HDR, maybe only using 10% of its potential, but anyway, it's possible to obtain a black and white that is very close to the original stock shades. We have performed many tests, because it was not a simple thing to do, especially when you have to use a technology that is there and was made to make films, whereas we started with films that had already been made in another time and on other supports and had been devised for the cinema. So many tests were needed, and literature was not available, because HDR tells you how to make a certain pose. But when I tell you that we have to use it in a prudent and a cautious way, the first test, there was Belmondo, and there was a window behind him that was very lit up, very heavily lit. And we could see the detail beyond the window, what was on the road beyond the window, and it was too much, because the attention would shift from the actor, Mr. Belmondo, to what was outside beyond the window, and this means betraying the work, because the focus of the film was the dialogue between the actor and the actress. So what was needed was to get back the lighting, the light of the film, and not concentrating on what was beyond the window. We lowered the brightness, and vis-à-vis the original DVD version, you could see much more, and where the original, you couldn't see anything beyond the window. And then there were, and in this case, HDR helped us a lot. There were, then there are scenes that show details that had gone astray, had gone lost, and before, and HDR was very efficient from the beginning, and could help us to show the contrast and the details, and of course it was much more expensive. But this technique was already existing, and our strategy in this sense was to say, is it really useful to use this technology and overcome the existing limits and finding back the details and the whole potential of the film? Another thing I would like to point out, HDR has been created for the video versions, whereas the version you have seen yesterday in the piazza that will be distributed in the cinema hall is a classical restoration work. So this is important for you to know. So it would be nice to have the description of the approach of Elephant Man, another black and white film, much more recent. But before talking about Elephant Man, I would like to say something else about bout de souffle. This was shot on a contrast film, therefore not a classic stock film, and it's for this reason that the original negative had been damaged. It was not a classical film, so it was not simple to make it scene by scene, but the power of HDR to some extent allowed us to respect and abide by the film, the stock of the type. Now let's talk about Elephant Man. The difference was that the director was with us during the restoration. I don't know if you want to say something about it, or I can talk about it. You have seen it, you worked, yes, we worked with the director himself, and usually it's the studio that asks the director to help, whereas in this case, David Lynch was really absolutely present. He worked very intensively, and he handled detail by detail. He was convinced, he was persuaded to make the restoration of the film, but not to use HDR. Elephant Man, a recent film with a great light exposure, well shot, a standard film on which to work at, and StudioCanal wanted to make an HDR version. So I went to Los Angeles and I met David Lynch. I was in touch with the producer, Sabrina, and then I met David to talk about the project. And before seeing it, the assistant said he doesn't agree with HDR because he doesn't understand it, so be careful and pay attention. So I met David Lynch, and there was the breaking of the ice. He did not have a lot of time. He sat at the table and he said, I don't agree. I don't understand why you want to use the HDR in a black and white film. And I said, I think it's the case for the reason I just listed to you, because you can be closer to the black and white, and there are going to be details of the blacks that are very respectful, and it's the video that disguise them and hide them. So he told me, I trust you, and we started with the restoration in Los Angeles, and this is the interesting part. He followed up all the scenes, and even more the sound than the image, and this is very important, because when we started with the restoration work, as I said, HDR has been created for videos, whereas we have made this work on films that was distributed in the cinema. So when I explained to David Lynch the workflow, we're going to have a photo cam with your grade, and then a Dolby poster that is such a big monitor. Then we were going to make the grading of the scenes, and he said, no, I want a cinema, I want a theater, and he was right. I said, okay, he was right. Why? David always thought in terms of the movie theater. That's his reference point. So also our reference point is the cinema screen. I'm not at all interested. He told me, I'm not interested in the technology. Show this to me on a theater screen, and then I give you the image as it should be shown in its original size, and then you make your task, your job, and then you call me. And it's the exact contrary of the standard workflow, because you usually start from the Dolby, and then you say, this is a genial, you make a passage, and the declination is automatic, because the HDR is made on the Dolby Pulsar, and afterwards you have the Dream Pass, and then you have the declination for the HDR10 and the SDR, and afterwards you make a passage onto the cinema screen. It's sort of a balancing out, a grading. This is the theory, but it applies to a video, but it doesn't really apply well to a film that was born 35 millimeters, and we, as restorators, we should apply the new technology in the right terms, and in this sense, David was right. And I was convinced that the 4K would be ideal. And David helped me out. How did we do it? We made a classic grading in the movie theater, and he told me what he wanted to start with. He wanted to start with a certain grading, and starting from this point that was authorized and validated by David Lynch, we made the HDR version on the smaller monitor, and he validated also the video version. But I believe that the important point is the approach, because we're talking about cinema, and I want the dimension of the cinema on a giant screen. And I believe that this approach is fundamental.
C'est presque incorrect d'appliquer d'une façon aveugle le workflow standard au patrimoine.
Because it's almost wrong to apply the standard workflow to the heritage.
La dernière technologie qui avait été inventée pour les films frais, pour les films nouveaux, et on l'a toujours pliée aux exigences.
We have always adapted the technology to the requirements of the heritage and the preservation of films.
Dans le monde argentique, on a fait ça. La TAI des débris qu'on utilise, qui était le seul vraiment utile de restauration,
also with the
c'était une tireuse
silver machines
optique alterne faite au début pour faire les gonflages. Après on a fait 35-35, on a mis l'immersion, c'était le seul outil. Mais c'était ça.
We use the 35 and then we use the immersion, but the beginning of the software for the restoration of the images was not created to make the restoration of films of last century, but simply because doing it with negative was less costly than taking away the scratches and calling Tom Cruise again on the set. And we took this technology and adapted it to our activities. Before, restoration was not involved in this, and technology was being applied only. So I believe that this approach that David imposed on us, I believe this was the right approach to be used. And surely the films has benefited from this. Of course, I'm not maybe objective because I myself did this restoration, but I can tell you offline that I'm quite satisfied with the result. And when David Lynch saw the HDR restoration and saw it, he recognized that there was absolutely an advantage on the blacks especially. Well, if you want to add something, otherwise I would like to talk about another technical aspect. Yes, you can be very satisfied with this restoration work. Now, as the workflow is concerned, well, it's fundamental. It's not a detail. It's fundamental because you make a film for the cinema and you have to start from there. Because if you do the reverse, you're not working for the movies, for the cinema. If you're working at a TV series, to some extent you can work on videos of Twin Peaks, just to talk about David Lynch. But if you work at a cinema product, you have to work on the wide screen. And this is a fundamental point. And then to talk about the instruments, well, there are a few producers that deal with restoration. I remember how long a time we would spend to correct the defects, the small defects of the film that had just been showed. One other point is the grain, and here we go back to the bout souffle, which has a problem of grain because, as I said, there was a contrast film. But when you do deal with HDR, you cannot afford to be too digital, because if you push too much onto this end, there is a degraining of the film. In a bout souffle, but also in Elephant Man, the HDR version has been reduced and the grain has been cut down because this version that is a little more violent of HDR would have the grain of the film emerge too much, so we had to attenuate the grain a little bit, which is a normal thing to do because we work on restoration. You do not touch upon the grain, and then you look at the supports, and then you adjust to the supports. And so the last point The last point is the zero grain management. Then the calculation of the fluorescence, and that for the so we had to degrain and attenuate the grain because there were advantages that to some extent would create unnatural effects. So the objective was not to cancel or erase the grain, but we wanted to render it a natural factor. And we made a degraining sequence by sequence. A bout de souffle is revealed itself a very complex film because all the tests we performed were made on the grain. Elephant Man is a little more simple, but often with the HDR you have to be careful because if you increase the signal, there's always the danger of having the cropping up of this jungle of pixels and grains of that is not natural. So it's very unpleasant. So the point is not to cancel the grain, but respect its acceptable size. That is the original one. Well, I have nothing else to say. I don't know if there are any questions. And if we have questions, we have 5 minutes for questions. Do we have any questions? I said that I hope very soon to be able to apply the HDR on a silent film. Now I recognize you.
Julia from Deutsche Kinematik. I was interested, why did you not choose HDR for the cinema version of A Bout de souffle? And I totally agree with David Lynch, which I never expected, that you should not choose a technology just to have at the end of the chain a stamp on it like HDR or
the last toy.
Even restoration. Which is sometimes not the right stamp, and so we should always do what the film demands. We should use the technology the film demands, and I'm very glad that you could choose this way of following the wish of the director in this case. So the one question about A Bout de souffle, and the other one, what generally is your reference if you think about which technology to apply and your aesthetic reference for scanning, for the technology workflow and for the grading in the end.
Alors, pour la question HDR salle, peut-être je te laisse à toi la parole. Pour moi, la réponse c'est que c'est trop tôt. Il y a pas encore.
For the question HDR in the halls and the theaters, well, it's too early. We don't have halls and we don't have cinemas that have HDR instruments. Only some theaters are equipped with these types of instruments, so it's a little bit too early, to my opinion. We don't do it for the latest films, but we do it once in a while when some event is present, but we will see how the market is. For the moment, the market is too at its very beginning. Now was well, last year I know that in Paris it was shown in the Salle Pathé. There are no infrastructures. There is only one theater in Milton that can do it in HDR. So the market is not there yet. The second question is a little bit more complex. Well, my answer is it depends. Like with philology, there is not only one way to restore, make the restoration of a film. There is a person who tells you how to do it. The same thing for books and philology. So it's up to us to know what are the instruments we have at our disposal, and maybe we do have some instruments, but to me, an emblematic case, 2 or 3 years ago, we made the restoration of Kinemacolor, and after years and years of tests that were failures, at the very end, we found the right workflow with a technology that was already there. Simply, we could not find the right way. So I believe it's a film that tells you which is the workflow that should be applied. You have to pay attention. You cannot be too highly technology-oriented. For instance, on Elephant Man, I would have started in a blind way, maybe with the first position not in the theater, in the movie theater. So you have to have a glance or a look that is innocent and virgin of the artist, that know the spirit of the film. Same applies to the restoration of the artwork, because the message is to make the restoration of the spirit of the artwork, and not the work art itself. That's why I talked about David Leitch and Caroline Champetier, because they told us for our film we have to pursue another way to obtain the optimal result. And they were right. Maybe I was too short-sighted and too immersed in the technology, or immersed in a film that was not mine. And maybe it's an optimistic message, but we should not be slaves of technology. We simply must use it and adapt it by working at it, working with films that are manufactured, that are created by men, human beings, and you have to treat them as artworks and works. So there is no ideal workflow, neither for the year 10s or the most recent films. There is no ideal workflow. We had to adjust the workflow for a film of 2001.
Thank you very much. Come from Madrid, from the Visual Heritage Master. I have a question. It's more related to the copyright consequences. How, I don't know if you can answer me. If what are the consequences of these restorations in terms of the strategy for the producers, in terms of the length, the years, the number of the years that you can have the copyright.
So si on parle de copyright.
If we talk about copyright, maybe I didn't understand the question well, but when we are lucky to work and collaborate with the director, well, he approves what we do, and then there is his own responsibility involved. Maybe if there is the extension of the timing for the copyright. No, the technical work does not change the timing of the copyrights. And then it's another story. There is altogether, when you do the restoration of a film, we try to work before to be able to enjoy of a certain number of years of these rights, and then you negotiate, but it's not negotiate. It would be nice. It would be a nice thing. It would be convenient to have an extension through technology. No other questions? Thank you very much. I hope you have appreciated this lesson of restoration, and thank you, and good continuation of this festival. Thank you.